There are 4 living classes of sponges. However, many of the earliest fossils just don't really fit into any of them. And when that happens, we have no choice really but to make a new section of the classification to accommodate them. So let me introduce the Ascospongiae. I'll also explain why these classic members of the Burgess Shale type faunas are nothing to do with demosponges, and try to see where we can slot them into early sponge evolution. All right, so this is going to be the next installment of my series on sponge evolution. And I know how many of you are getting hooked on these, so I couldn't hold off for too long. So what I've done so far, for those who haven't caught up with them yet, is an introduction to sponges, one on the hexactin problem, as I called it, which is the fact that a feature, the hexactin spicule, that is diagnostic of modern hexactinellids, seems to be much more widely distributed among early sponges, and what that means for their evolution. And I've also done one on the demosponges and tracing their ancestry back to their origins. And there's one on the chancelloriids, which may or may not be sponges. So if you are completely new to this, you might want to catch up on a few of those first. But for those who've already caught up, let's dive in. When you're studying paleontology, finding a new species is actually a really common occurrence. And practically everyone in the field ends up describing a new species at some point, and for some people it's hundreds. There are really a lot of new things still to be found. For genera, they're a bit rarer, but yeah, anyone who's doing quite a lot of taxonomy will describe new genera. Families, less so, and when you go further up the hierarchy, to orders, classes, phyla, almost nobody ever describes a new class or phylum. I mean, it does happen, but it's really quite rare, because the higher up the hierarchy we go, the better an idea we have of what existed, because we'll have had at least a few examples of each of them. So it's really quite a privilege to get to name an entire new class of, for example, sponges. Just as a recap, there are 4 living sponge classes, and one of them was only actually identified in 2012, or at least formally recognized. And that was on the basis of genetics. It had been lumped in with the demosponges before then. This may be a theme that comes back again. But I've got an introduction video on the sponges, as I say, so that will give you the outline of these major groups. So we have the homoscleromorphs, this new group that has just recently been recognized, the calcareans, hexactinellids, and demosponges. That's it. So because of genetic studies, we have now got a pretty solid understanding of how they relate to each other. So the least certain is the homoscleromorphs, but even that is pretty confidently tied as the sister group to Calcarea. And unfortunately, neither of these have much of a fossil record. It's a bit of a pain. But the other branch, the Cilicia, which consists of hexactinellids and demosponges, is pretty well known. And those we have quite a good record of their history going back to the Cambrian-ish. We can see how their ancestry developed, and we have a fairly good understanding of their evolutionary patterns in terms of the genetics, so the arrangement of the branches of the tree. And those two form one group, the Cilicia, which is a sister group to the Calcarea and homoscleromorpha, and those are your 4 branches. Once you get back into the Paleozoic, though, and especially into the Cambrian, sponges start being a little more difficult to interpret. One particular group is known, or has been known traditionally, as the Protomonaxonids, and this turns up in virtually every Cambrian and Ordovician Burgess Shale type fauna, and elsewhere as well, but mainly in those deposits because they need exceptional preservation to fossilize them. But these are ubiquitous. They're usually the dominant group of sponges in these faunas, and they are familiar to practically anyone who works in these deposits. So if you look at the Huayuan biota that we did the previous video on, that includes various sponges that include things like Choia, this pincushion type thing, which is classified in this group. It's been called a protomonaxonid. And this is like I say, an extremely abundant and fairly diverse group, but you get the same genera turning up all over the world, and it's just become part of the scenery. Everyone knows about them, and they are accepted as a major part of these faunas. They're quite varied in form, from this little pincushion that you could leave on somebody's chair if you don't like them, to the conical things like Halichondrites, to tubular ones like Leptomitus with sort of twisting spicules running all the way up the length. But they all share one feature in common, which gives them their name, and that is the presence of big monaxon spicules. So by monaxon, we mean a single axis, basically big needles. So I certainly didn't discover these sponges to start with. I mean, they go back to 1886, I believe was the first one that was described. That was Leptomitus by Walcott. Then Walcott struck again in 1920 when he did a monograph of the Burgess Shale sponges, and that named many more genera, things like Choia and so on, ended up being described at that time. So when Walcott described them, he classed them in the Monaxonida, which is a now outdated term describing the demosponges that have monaxon spicules. So there are other groups that have monaxons, but this was how he classified them. And included within this group were the hazeliids, which we have encountered in the video on demosponges, because they are almost certainly, and pretty much everyone agrees as far as I know, very early demosponges. They have classic demosponge architecture, skeleton, and so on. So it's a bit of a smorgasbord between things which are definitely demosponges and then things like Choia and Leptomitus. So the next major revision of the large-scale taxonomy of these sponges really came in 1955 with the Treatise on Invertebrate Palaeontology, Part E, Porifera. This was by M.W. de Lobenfels, who was a very prominent sponge biologist but didn't really do fossils. So he wasn't quite sure what he was doing with some of these, I suspect, and there are problems with that version of the treatise, but still, it's what we got, and he did do a lot of revisions. One of the first things he did was actually define lots of families to encompass the strange genera from the Cambrian faunas. So the Leptomitidae, the Choidae, all the Piraniidae, various things which basically were families erected to accommodate just one or two genera in most cases. But he classified these in a range of places. I'm going to have to check my notes on this one. They're all over the place. So Choia, he included in the Epipalaecidae, an order which has now been abandoned, but was a group of tetractinellid demosponges, so things that have tetractins rather than just monaxon spicules, which is a bit odd because Choia doesn't have tetractins, but there we go. He included them there. Wapkia and Takakawia, which we'll come back to in a separate video, certainly, he put into the haplosclerid demosponges, along with Hazelia. And Hamptonia he put into the poecilosclerids. Pirania ended up in the Hadromerida, which is another order of demosponges. And some of these things are nothing at all like other living members of those groups. It was just they were the least dissimilar, I guess, and so they were basically slotted in and pushed into these groups because the demosponges were the only manageable group available. Well, not quite, because Leptomitus he put into the Leptomitidae, which he inserted into the hexactinellids, but also mentioned that they might be haplosclerid demosponges. And he considered this to be evidence that the classes were not clearly distinct at this point, that they hadn't really diverged enough and you couldn't really tell whether it was a demosponge or hexactinellid. So that was all a little bit confused. It got simplified quite a lot more when Keith Rigby did the next monograph, the revision of Walcott's 1920 version, in 1986. So doing the Burgess Shale sponges and reclassifying everything and adding lots more species and so on. And he simplified this enormously by slotting them all into the demosponge order Monaxonida. even though he appreciated at the time that this was not a valid order because it was not monophyletic. It was known at that point that there were several different groups of monaxonid sponges, but he considered it was still a useful term for paleontological circles, and so he just threw all of these families into the Monaxonida and left it there, basically. He did also say that they were so different from modern demosponges that it was very hard to apply the modern classification, and so he simply left them floating in their own families within the Monaxonida. The last major change, until we come up to the recent, is in 2004 when Rigby and Finks and Rigby, in fact, revised the treatise. So this is a revision of the de Lobenfels volume from 1955. And the treatise, for those who don't know, is effectively the standard assignment compilation of taxonomy. It lists every known fossil genus within a major group and classifies them, giving you a structure which then forms the standard that everyone should work with unless there's good reason not to. So in this one, which the work had actually been going on, as I understand, from about the 70s and 80s, so it was a very old volume in its origins that then was eventually published in 2004. This version, he didn't use the Monaxonida. They erected a new order called the Protomonaxonida. And this was basically defined to accommodate these sponges. It was slightly odd because the definition, the diagnosis of the Protomonaxonida was included within the demosponges as fibrous skeleton composed of oxias alone. Now, this actually, as far as I can make out, covers practically every group of monaxonid demosponge. So I have no idea how this is distinguished from the other ones. And there were, aside from the Burgess Shale protomonaxonids, including the Leptomitus, which he moved back from the hexactins into the demosponges, there was also a small selection of modern demosponge families were slotted into this group as well. So it sort of gave us a framework in that there was now a name, the Protomonaxonida, which covered basically all of these long monaxon spicule things that we get in the Burgess Shale type faunas worldwide. And these things were slotted into the demosponges, but kind of in their own group with just a few other random families picked, well, not random, but a few other families picked from other groups of demosponges and squeezed in with them. Those other families are things like the Solocelidae and the Tethiidae, which are really nothing much at all like the ones in the Cambrian faunas. So it's a bit confusing and complicated, and anyone who looks at this with fresh eyes starts looking a little bit askance, because it doesn't make a lot of sense. So that's what we've inherited. There's a very good and steadily improving phylogeny of modern demosponges based on both molecular work and morphological work, mainly molecular to sort out the really difficult bits. And that's all good. It's definitely getting there. But the treatment of the fossils just causes problems whenever you try to do something with them in that framework. You try to incorporate them into the modern biological framework and it just breaks the whole thing. So I've gone through all this just to sort of explain the history behind it and how we've got to this point, and to explain also that what I'm about to describe as a different interpretation doesn't just come out of nowhere. Let's get back to the basics. Why were they classified as demosponges at all? And it really just comes down to the shape of the spicules. So they're monaxons. Unfortunately, the monaxons are not restricted to demosponges today. It's a very simple spicule type. It's just basically a needle-shaped thing, either pointed at both ends or maybe rounded at one and pointed at the other. There's a bit of variation, but they're basically uniaxial, very, very simple structures. And you do get some hexactinids, for example, which have dominantly monaxial spicules. However, their structure or the architecture is always very different, and there are also always layers like the dermal or gastral layers which have hexactins and equivalents as well. So even the ones which have gone furthest towards being monaxon dominated, like some of the rossellids, for example, still have these other spicules within the structure. There are also calcareans with monaxons, but in that case the monaxons are absolutely minute, probably smaller even, I think, than pretty much all the demosponges, so on a similar scale to the smaller demosponges. And they're also made of calcite, which gives you a totally different preservational history. But there's one other extra bit of support for demosponges, which is that the spicules of some of these protomonaxonids are, like the Choiidae, are often described as radial in arrangement, and that fits some modern demosponges like the Tethiidae. However, there are problems even at this level of detail, big problems. So to start with, the spicules in the protomonaxonids are often multiple centimeters, up to 20 centimeters long. They are very rarely less than a centimeter. And in extreme cases, they are enormous. In demosponges, the spicules are usually less than 1 millimeter, up to a maximum of maybe 2 or 3 millimeters. They're small structures. Same with calcareans. Some of the hexactinellids do have bigger ones as well, and especially in the root tuft, but that's a different structure again. But in terms of the similarity to demosponges, they're on a different scale by a couple of orders of magnitude. And then there's this arrangement issue. So when they're described as radial, we're talking about something like Choia. So you have this radial array of spicules flattened onto the bedding plane. The problem is that the body form of Choia and its relatives was basically a very shallow cone. So those spicules are not radial, they're longitudinal. You see, radial means perpendicular to the body wall. And this is what you see in the demosponges, things like the Tethiids and so on. You have spikes of spicules projecting out from the surface of the sponge. The body wall architecture is of little bundles of tiny monaxons that diverge outwards and project from the surface of the wall. That's not what this thing is in Choia at all. Here you've just got a very shallow wall, but the spicules are parallel to the wall and sticking out through the end of it. This is a totally fundamentally different arrangement, and describing them as radial is actually wrong. It's a radial array, but they are longitudinal spicules. So what you have now is an array of spicules where the skeletal architecture is basically perpendicular to most of the architecture in the demosponges they're being compared with, and in which the spicules are at least an order of magnitude, and quite often two, larger than the spicules that they're being compared with. You can describe it as a radial array of monaxons and compare that with some demosponges where you have a radial array of monaxons, but it is a totally different thing that is being hidden by those words. So that has actually removed any obvious reason to classify them as demosponges. You can always say that, well, they're extremely early, very primitive things, and therefore they were different. But we actually know quite well what the early demosponges were like, thanks to the Burgess Shale. And alongside these enormous spiculed weird things, we have things like Heselia, which have a beautiful array of tiny monaxons, plumoreticulate architecture, and it is a very simplified version of the body wall structure that we see in the later spiculate demosponges. And there's no argument about Heseliids being demosponges. It's just that somehow these other groups have been lumped in because of this description of monaxon spicules. And when you actually look at them objectively, they are completely different things. So I think that assignment to demosponges is purely a relic of tradition. One thing that's important to remember here is that Walcott was working before we had any real idea of the diversity of life that you get in the Cambrian. And he was shoehorning, that is the term that's often used, these various fossils of all groups into modern groups of organisms. So weird arthropods would become crustaceans and so on. And this is just the strategy that he employed in trying to classify these organisms. And in virtually all of the other groups, these bits of shoehorning have been undone, and we now recognize them as stem groups and aberrant extinct lineages and that sort of thing. But in the case of sponges, somehow we've ended up stuck with the tradition. And I think that's a situation that we still had up to 2004 and even later. I mean, I've even fallen into this. I did a paper in 2007 on the demosponges of the freshwater biota, an early Ordovician Burgess Shale type fauna. And yes, I went with the status quo and called them demosponges. And this was before I'd had time to go completely heretical, but it just goes to show the power of tradition. That was what the classification was in the taxonomy. I went with it. I didn't have reasons to argue against it at that point, although I still had my doubts already. So it really started to kick off around 2012, 2013, when I couldn't live with this type of classification, which was, in my mind by then, clearly completely spurious. So in 2013, Lucy and I published a classification or a revision of the protomonaxonids, trying to assess them objectively and trying to get to some sort of answer as to what we should really be doing with them. The first thing to notice is that there were two major groups that were lumped into the same classification. So on the one hand, you have these things like Heselia with a plumoreticulate architecture of tiny little monaxons in an array that looks like demosponges, and I have no problem with those being demosponges. They are. I'm sure everyone agrees with that. And there was actually a clear separation between these things, Heselia, Chromulospongia, and that's about it, a couple of others, and the things with the bigger spicules. That was a major fundamental division, is the size of the spicules. Those larger spicules are also longitudinal dominantly. There's a bit of variation in that there's also a transverse element in the Leptomitus, which left as possibly a separate group, but probably a sort of sister group to the others, because there are so many other similarities in the structure. On top of that, there was also Tachycawia, which deserves its own video, and I'd already the previous year removed that entirely from the protomonaxonids because it's something else entirely. Okay, but these things with the long spicules, which I ended up calling the group 1 protomonaxonids without formally defining any new term, also showed basically a continuum. So you have a wide range of variation from things like the coids, with their basically disc-shaped bodies, to very tall, slender things, conical ones, with spicules not just within the wall, but also sticking out from it, to Piraniids, where they take it a step further and have isolated, big, sort of organic walled spines sticking out from the side. But there was a continuum of structure and architecture all the way through. It's actually difficult to recognize separate families because they blend into each other. But there were a couple of anomalies, big anomalies, at either end of this spectrum. So let's start at the derived end. So this is the conical forms with the spicules that start sticking out from the wall. The spicules get bigger. In some cases, you have things like Linica, which has, they can be 20 or 30 centimeters long. It's quite a big sponge, but it's basically just a sort of fan-shaped array when it's flattened, but a sort of conical array of these big spicules. And there's a couple of things that are important about these spicules, which are totally different from not only demosponges, but every other group. First thing is, you very rapidly start to notice that they have conical open bases. This is really weird. They've been described before in some cases being styles, so they have a rounded base. But there's quite a lot of material that we illustrated in this paper from the Hetang biota, early Cambrian of South China. We've never been able to write them up properly because of moving research group, and it's a little bit difficult politically, but so we've not actually given them names, but they're illustrated. And you see that they have these conical spicules, very gradually tapered, but they get wider to one end. And if these were has described normal mineralized silica spicules, which were getting thicker to that end, then that would be the more robust end. That would be the end that is less easily dissolved. What you see instead is that they fade out to the wide end. And this is not just one or two, it's consistent. They basically just disappear. So you have here something which, by our understanding of how these things should fossilize, appears to be completely open-based. Now, I did see this more clearly in Pirania, with one specimen which was slightly pyritized alongside these other ones which are much more organic preservation and flattened. But this one pyritized one seems to be a cone, and you can see it's three-dimensional and it's truncated where it hits the body wall. It basically is an organic open-based sclerite. Now, Lord Sway and others have since argued that this is a chancelloreid sclerite that is loose on the surface and just happens to be situated in a way that makes it look like it's a spicular Pirania, or at least that it could be that. And all I would say to that is that it's theoretically possible. It doesn't look like a chancelloreid sclerite to me because there's only the one ray, and you get one-rayed ones in China, but not in the Burgess Shale. And also, it doesn't have the rounded base with the foramen that you should get in a chancelloreid sclerite. But even if that is, and it's possible, then probably possible, then it doesn't explain all these other ones from the Hertang biota, which are clearly not chancelloreids. They have these structures which are much more like these other Hamptoniid, Halichondritid like sponges, Piraniid, and there's an array of them with this pretty straightforward conical open base. Now, one of the nice things about having big spicules is that you have a higher chance of getting the original mineralogy preserved. And sticking with the Hertang biota, in the previous year, 2012, we had a paper where we described the internal structure and mineralogy of Linica, this one with the biggest spicules of all. Now, unfortunately, different minerals have different stability in terms of chemical stability under different burial conditions. So you're very unlikely to get two different minerals, original minerals, preserved pristine in the same spicule, which is just annoying, but you can still work out a lot. So in this case, what we have is consistently a structure with an axial region composed of one material that's always preserved as silica, an outer region that is not preserved pristine at all, but is usually replaced by blocky pyrite crystals or just as a void, and then a thin layer of organic material that's pyritized on the very outside. Now, in one or two specimens, we could do analysis of the quite detailed analysis in SEM of the structure of these things, or the chemistry, and they're clearly pure silicon dioxide. At very high magnification, we see it has conchoidal fracture. There is no crystallinity there. It hasn't recrystallized as that. This is cryptocrystalline silica, chalcedony. And that you would not expect to see happening unless it was originally opal, which is then recrystallized as chalcedony, which is what normally happens to opal, because opal itself is metastable, but it then recrystallizes as cryptocrystalline quartz, and then normally that then recrystallizes as crystalline quartz. Okay, we also have one example of these where the silica core even has a core to that as well, a much thinner axial structure running down the middle. That one is actually silicified. It's a little bit sort of rubbly and replaced, but there was a structure down the center which matches what you expect for an axial canal that you get in silica spicules. So what we can see in this part is absolutely typical. You have what was originally an organic filament in the middle, silica spicules secreted around it, only partly recrystallized to chalcedony, and we have the structure left, which is great. But the outer part of the spicule is never preserved as silica, which implies that it was a different composition. It's usually replaced by blocky pyrite, which doesn't tell you very much, but in some cases there are also lots of fans of gypsum, calcium sulfate, which also doesn't tell you much because it's sort of a weathering product of pyrite. But on the other hand, it does imply that there is a source of calcium here to get significant numbers of those crystals. Again, it's very vague, it doesn't tell you much at all, but you can say it's a different mineral. However, Linica is not only found in the Huttung biota, and in fact it was first described from the Sinsk biota, where you have limestones. And there, what you get is the central part is invariably dissolved. It's just disappeared completely. The outer part is invariably preserved as calcite in a limestone. So the sort of environmental conditions where calcite would be stable because it's supersaturated with calcium carbonate around it, so it just doesn't really go anywhere. It might recrystallize in situ, but it's going to stay as calcite. So we have a situation here where the other biomineral that is used by sponges, in spicules especially, which is calcium carbonate, calcite, is also present, apparently, on the outside of a structure which was originally silicious and had a typical silica secretion mechanism. On the outside of the presumed calcite layer, we also have an organic layer, and calcium carbonate spicules are secreted inside an organic sheath rather than onto an organic filament. So you seem to have both mechanisms of creating a spicule in the same spicule. And I say you basically can't get both of them pristine because of the sensitivity to conditions, but in fact a Russian group of authors has since found Linica spicules in which you do get both calcite and silica preserved as calcite and silica. So this now seems to be very widely accepted, I think reasonably widely accepted, that this genuinely is bimineralic spicules made of calcite and silica, both secretion mechanisms, in a way that you basically don't get in any living sponges. Slight caveat. There is a description of a single species of modern hexactinellid, Caulophacus, where you get a silica-dominated skeleton, as you expect, but the spicules are sort of fused together by little spines on the surfaces, which then sort of get cemented or overgrown onto each other. And the cores of those spines are made of calcite. So there's a relic there of something in a modern hexactinellid being able to secrete both calcite and silica at different stages in the growth of the spicule. But it's probably not telling us much at all, aside from it happened and it is a biochemical process that is possible within even living sponges. I should also say that this outer organic layer that we see in some of these things is actually much more robust than what we get in living sponges, even calcareans, where it's basically a micrometric thick sheet. Here, it was actually quite clearly preservable, and that you look at something like Pirania at the extreme end, and you can see in some of the Burgess specimens, not just that the spicules are preserved as organic impressions on the surface, but in some cases there is a relic of a bimineral central part, not filling up the entirety of the organic part, but a rod down the center which is preserved slightly more robustly. That will be, we assume, the silica part of it. And then in some of these spicules, they're actually twisted, which is not something that you can really do with a normal spicule, not like that. So it looks like there was maybe loss of the calcite at some point. We haven't got enough pristine material to tell, but these were complex architectures within the spicules. You have structures that we do not see in any living class. There is no way you can squeeze that into demosponges, or hexactinellids for that matter. Now let's look at the other end of this spectrum. So if you go back to the base of these things, you end up with these very simple purely wall parallel spicules, things like Choia, Leptomitus as well, in a very different body form. And there's a whole array of other things, again, which most of them we illustrate in this 2013 paper, which have this sort of conical mass of longitudinal monaxons. Not much else going on until you look closely. And then you realise that these little sort of rubbly holes all over the surface in some of these specimens are not random. They are actually little spicules. In fact, they're little hexactins, little tiny stubby rayed, short rayed hexactins, sometimes with the rays reduced almost to balls. So there's actually a paper describing the eggs of trilobites and the chylibiota, and we do have pretty compelling evidence that in fact those are not eggs, they're spicules. It's a sponge that lost the monaxon part of it and ended up as just the spicules being effectively spherical. And hopefully that will be tested now. I know there's somebody looking at it and hoping to get some sort of internal structure out of it. But yeah, they're not trilobite eggs, they are sponge spicules. That's the extreme case of it. But you see a lot of these sponges in the Hertang biota especially, where you have a protomonaxonid array of spicules, and within them you have an array of tiny little short-rayed, stubby hexactins. Slightly modified hexactins, slightly odd ray angles and so on, but they're quite common there. There's also one or two examples, not many at all, and I wish I'd done more with them at the time when I had the chance, where you have not short-rayed, stubby ones, but very clear normal hexactin derivatives, storactins maybe, slender rayed things in a diagonal orientation, just like you get in something like Diagonella, but superimposed on this mass of longitudinal monaxons. And of course, you wouldn't expect there to be hexactins in the earliest demosponges, except have a look at the video on the earliest demosponges and you'll find that there is, but in a very different way. So these things are very, very different to anything that we have today. Just to add yet another level of chaos, we have also a thing called heteractinigma, which probably deserves its own video as well at some point. But this one is from the Ordovician, actually. It's a unique one-off novelty that we've never found anything else quite like it, except that it is a leptomitid. It has the structure of Leptomitus. It's got the tall, thin body form, cylindrical little marginalia around the osculum. It's got longitudinal array of slender monaxons in bundles, and it's got transverse bundles of little monaxons as well. It's basically a leptomitid. The only problem is that it also has little hexactins and pentaradiate spicules and triactins, and it's got a whole array of tiny little spicules sort of within this body wall, which have no counterpart really anywhere else, except possibly for an even weirder thing called Petaloption, which I'm not going anywhere near at the moment, but will come back to again, believe it. So this, in terms of the protomonaxonids, there's nothing else with these types of spicules. It's a novelty. We don't know how many of these features were evolved within Heteractinigma and how many are ancestral, but you've clearly still got the combination of these longitudinal monaxons and hexactin type derivative things there as well. So, okay, could the protomonaxonids be some sort of demosponge? Hopefully I've convinced you that they have no similarity to demosponges whatsoever. Could there be hexactinellids? Again, there's basically no similarity. You've got these little hexactins, and if you go by the assumption that hexactins are a derived feature of hexactinellids and therefore everything with them is a hexactinellid, then you are forcing yourself to try to squeeze them into hexactinellids, but there is nothing like them today in any form. There is nothing that is clearly hexactinellid related in the fossil record that has anything like this sort of architecture. You trace hexactinellids back through time and you end up with regular grid, these reticulosum sponges. And you don't get things with a massive array of longitudinal spicules. You don't get bimineralic spicules with that weird little exception to, which is, well, We don't know quite how that fits in. There just doesn't seem to be any similarity really to hexactinellids apart from these hexactins. So one other question is, could the protomonaxonids actually be two groups? So you have the leptomitids on one side, and you have this other branch with choids and habitoniids and halichondrites and Pirania being an entirely separate group that happens to look vaguely similar. Is that possible? That was why I held off for so long on actually trying to formalize this as a distinct group of sponges. What I really needed was something linking the two groups together, and I knew it was out there because I'd seen photos. We mentioned this in the 2013 paper. There is a choid from the Freshwater biota that has hexactins in it. If you have something on that branch which also shares the little hexactins that you get in the other branch and in the basal ones as interpreted, then I have no problem with them being the same group. But these specimens were in a private collection, and therefore I couldn't actually publish them, I couldn't illustrate them. So it's just, they're there, and I've been waiting for it to turn up. And eventually it did turn up, but not in the Freshwater, although that's still there to be found, I think, rather in Castlebank. So finally, 2021, we started finding a whole array of sponges, including this thing, which is a species of Choia. It's one of the discoidal ones, a mass of radiating spicules as preserved, which were, of course, longitudinal in life. And within this skeleton, there are a mass of tiny little hexactin spicules. Now, we know from Castlebank that the siliceous spicules are not preserved loose in this material. They get dissolved because it's probably because of acidic conditions, but for whatever reason, the only things that are preserved as loose spicules are ones with a thick organic wall. We see that all over the place. And we found one or two bits where there's silicified sediment and it's full of little hexactins that are dissolved most of the time. So these were not loose spicules. These are something which was part of the sponge. And we actually found it in multiple specimens where you have the soft tissue preservation. The spicules are poorly preserved, but there are definitely little hexactins or their derivatives within the soft tissue. So what can you do except name it? So it was Choia hexactinophora, meaning the Choia hexactin bearer. And this was the last piece of evidence needed that these protomonaxonids, the group 1 protomonaxonids as they had been called, formed their own group. They were monophyletic, they were a continuum, and they have a whole suite of unique characters which preclude them from being put into any of the other classes. And so I named a new class. So if they form a class on their own, where does that class fit into sponge evolution? That's where it gets trickier, because it is so distinct in morphology and structure from all of the other groups that it's hard to really claim that it is more similar to one class than any others. That's kind of the whole point. But on the other hand, we also have the fossil record, and there are some similarities, in particular to Diagonella. Now that might seem like an odd thing to say, because that is a peculiar sort of thing which is made entirely of storactins, except that it isn't, because they also have basalia. They have this sort of conical vasiform body shape, and they have this diagonal array of hexactin derivatives throughout this thin wall, so that much is similar, the wall shape. But they also have basal anchoring spicules that extend from the wall down into the sediment. And in some species you don't see any, in others there are quite a few. So you can imagine a situation in which those basal spicules were multiplied. They're just stronger than the normal grid that you get in Diagonella usually. And eventually they take over, that you end up with more and more of these longitudinal spicules that started out of basalia and then became the dominant spicule type, and a reduction and a loss of the little hexactins and their derivatives. So that would explain this one specimen that we had from the Hutang, which actually shows a Diagonella-like partial grid of hexactin derivatives and a dense wall of a protomonaxonid. Sorry, an ascosponge. And so there does seem to be at least a trace of continuity between Diagonella and these basal ascosponges. Which, yeah, that might be significant. The problem is, what's Diagonella? If you ask most people still, they would say, well, it's got hexactin derivatives, therefore it's a hexactinellid. We also know from the limited work that's been done so far, just an abstract published, that it appears to have calcite spicules, possibly bimineralic with a distinct core in the center, but calcite seems to be present. We're waiting for a full paper on that, which will actually explain what the real situation is, but the work that's been done so far looks like they were calcite, which doesn't really fit with a hexactinellid. The architecture is not like hexactinellids. It's an extremely thin wall, single layer of spicules, and it doesn't show any of the derived hexactinellid features. So again, going back to the hexactin problem, where you get hexactins and their derivatives turning up all over the place, we would argue that the presence of hexactins is actually a primitive character of sponges, not a derived one of hexactinellids. In which case, a group which may be in the stem group of Silicea, so a sister group to hexactinellids plus demosponges, or it may be in the stem group of Porifera as a whole. And at the moment, it's not entirely clear where that should go. There's one tantalizing bit of information, though, which is that the structure of Pirania is quite interesting. It has a sort of dermal ornament, architecture, something on the surface, which is different from any sponges and looks like what you see in Chancelloriids, where it has been argued to be an epidermis, or the impressions of an epidermis secreting the spicules, the sclerites. Now, if there is, as we've also argued, see the Chancelloriid video, continuity between Pirania and Chancelloriids, then that means that this group probably had an epidermis. Now, sponges do have relics of an epidermis, both genetically and in the homoscleromorphs. They have a basal membrane, which is part of the structure of it. So it looks like ancestrally sponges had an epidermis. And in that case, if we are seeing relics of it in some of these ascosponges, then that would imply that the ascosponges are in the stem group, most likely, of Porifera rather than of Silicea, just because it means that the features are being lost sequentially up the tree rather than multiple times in different branches. So how does this all work when you name something like a class? I mean, if you name a species, it is constrained by the International Code of Zoological Nomenclature. There's a rule book for exactly how it is done. That rule book goes up to family level. Above that, it's not defined in quite the same way. You still have to go through the taxonomic process in order to get it published in the first place, but technically it is a little less constrained. So this means that when I propose, and that's the word that I used, this class Ascospongiae, I can't then dictate that everyone uses it. It's not a formal taxonomic term in quite the same way, in that people have to take account of it. If you're dealing with ascosponges from elsewhere, or doing some taxonomy on them, you have to do the higher classification, and you have to state which higher classification you're putting them into. And it does mean that they now have to be discussed. So there are now the two options: the traditional, they're demosponges, or the class Ascospongiae. I know there are some groups who are still slightly on the fence about whether we can truly call this a separate class of sponge, and they are currently going with, I believe, the Group 1 Protomonaxonida of Botting et al. 2013. So that is bypassing it by recognizing them as a group, but not recognizing the name of the class. But there are ways of doing it, but the point is that it now has to be discussed, and it will come down to what people use over the next decades really, as to whether this gets established and accepted as a distinct class of sponges, or whether it is basically forgotten about and everyone goes back to calling them demosponges, which would be a little bit silly if you ask me, but there you go. I don't have a say in what everyone else thinks. But this is how it works at this point. You make a case. It's basically presenting an argument and saying, and therefore, based on this definition, I think these are a completely separate group of sponges with these characters. List them all, give them a diagnosis, give it a name. People can use it or they don't. And hopefully people will use it, because it's always nice if people use a class you created. But we'll see. It may be that new evidence comes to light that shows that actually they're a really weird group of homoscleromorphs or something. But at the moment, that doesn't seem to be happening. So we just need to build up more evidence around it to see whether it really sticks. There have been other extinct classes of sponges that have been defined in the past, but they've mostly fallen by the wayside. So you have, for example, the Archaeocyatha, which most recent work on that, assuming that they really are sponges, is coming down on the view that they're actually basal demosponges. And I think there are multiple lines of evidence suggesting that, and I actually agree that they are derived from one of these very early groups of Cambrian demosponges, which then proliferated and then died out again. There are other groups like the heteractinids, which are now thought to be probably stem group calcareans, as most people have all along. But this is a group which I think is well defined and has multiple unique features, which you can define on the basis of the spicule structure, the architecture of the sponge, the body form, the spicule complement, and so on. So I think that this is a solid one, and probably gave rise to the Chancelloriids, although that will be decided by future work, I'm sure, but that's what we've argued, and probably have not got any other descendants. So it is a true extinct monophyletic class in our view. Okay, that's the next installment. We are now getting into some of the weirder bits of the sponge fossil record. I think I'm going to have to do Takakawea next, just because it's so crazy. And you'll love it. Right, when I say next, I mean next in the sponge series. Might need to do some echinoderms. If you want some weirdness, then you can't really beat echinoderms. Anyway, I will see you again soon. Ta-ra for now.